right. Well, welcome everybody. My name is Elizabeth Chur, and I'm a volunteer with Swing Left San Francisco. Thank you so much for coming to today's workshop, You and the 34%, How to Have Meaningful Conversations with High Potential Voters. My co-presenter, Dr. Jackie Tulsky, and I are thrilled to be with you today, and we're so honored that the Wisconsin Democrats invited us to present. So before we get started, I would just like to take a moment to acknowledge Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the heroic efforts of the Ukrainian people to defend their country and protect their democracy. We stand in solidarity with the Ukrainians and people all over the world who sacrifice so much to defend their rights to self-governance. And we invite you to take just a few moments of silence to remember their struggle as we gather today. Thank you. So here in the US, we face our own challenges to our democratic systems, and that's democracy with a little d. Right now, there are powerful forces at work trying to pit us against each other or drown us in a sea of cynicism and despair. But together, we are so much stronger than those forces. And we hope that some of what we share today will give you a new approach to shoring up our democracy by creating meaningful connections with our fellow Americans, one person at a time. What you are doing is truly democracy in action, and we salute your courage and your dedication. Thank you so much. So I know we have some people from around the country joining us, and if you haven't already done so, we invite you to put your city and state in the chat. We'd love to find out a little bit more about all of you before we kick this off. And I'm just wondering if you could raise your physical hand if you live in Wisconsin. Do we have any Wisconsinites in the house? All right. And what if you live outside of Wisconsin and you'll be reaching out to Wisconsin voters by phone or text or maybe even in person? Can you raise your hand? Wonderful. All right. Yay. And then finally, I'm going to ask you to raise your hand if you've ever talked to a voter who tells you, I'm not voting. Anybody hear that? Yes, I've heard that a lot. So great. So we hope by the end of this training that I'm not voting will be the start rather than the end of your conversation with these voters. So just a few quick housekeeping items. We ask you to please keep yourself muted most of the time. If you have questions, feel free to drop them in the chat and we'll answer them at the end of the training. We are recording this session, but only the speakers will be on video, and we'll send you a link after the training as well as a copy of the slides. We will also invite you to complete a survey. This is a work in progress, and we'd be really grateful for your feedback. We know 2 hours is a long time to be on Zoom, and we appreciate your participation. We're just going to go straight through the program today, but if you need a quick bathroom or stretch break, go for it. So just a quick overview of today. Viola Nizigama from the Wisconsin Democrats will kick us off with an overview of what is at stake in Wisconsin this year. Then we'll give you some context about the importance of high potential voters. We'll share a few stories and provide suggestions for how to connect with this very important group. We'll demonstrate a few interactions and then give you a chance to practice in small groups. And afterwards, we hope some of you can stick around for an optional Q&A. So we have 3 goals for today's workshop. First, we hope that you'll learn some concrete new skills for navigating challenging conversations. Second, you'll get a chance to build these skills in the practice sessions. And third, and most importantly, we hope that you will come away with some new tools that will help make phone banking and canvassing less stressful, more effective, and more satisfying. So again, just a reminder, if you haven't had a chance to print out the handout that we sent you in advance, now would be a great time to do that. And we'll be referring to it several times during the training, and you'll need it for the practice sessions. It also has some handy phrases on the last 3 pages. Myra has posted another copy of that document in the chat. And if you don't have a printer, we just suggest that you download the file and have it available on your computer or your iPad for the practice sessions. So now I'm going to hand it over for a few minutes to Viola Nizigama, the Distributed Organizing Director with the Democratic Party of Wisconsin, to share what's at stake in Wisconsin this year.
Yeah. Hello, everyone. Thank you, Elizabeth. Thank you, everyone, for being here. So I've seen some familiar faces, and it is just so amazing. And I believe I spoke to some of you yesterday over the phone. So great to see you all here. I would do a quick overview so we can get started with the training. But in terms of what's at stake in Wisconsin, so we have it's a midterm election. We have some important election dates that are upcoming. The first one being April 5th, and that is a very local focused elections that are happening that day. But I will go into why we're even calling even for local elections here in a little bit. But that is the first one that's coming up right around the corner. The next one being the August primaries, and then the midterm elections on November 8th. Those are big dates. So why they matter? There's a lot at stake, right? We have the local elections happening. We have the Senate that we're trying to win, and then we have working to reelect Governor Evers. And these elections always, I think, Wisconsin, and we can even see across the country, like it always comes down to a small margin. And so making sure that we are connecting with voters and doing all of this work ahead of time will help us close that, that tiny margin that needs to be closed in order to keep our democracy up and running. And this going into why we're even calling for local elections is that it is crucial, especially if we're electing elections officials who will make sure that all votes are counted. And this will go to not only make people feel empowered and their voices heard, but it also helps build voting habits for voters and increase voter engagement. One thing we like to say is that if we can turn out voters to vote for the spring elections, they're more likely to turn out to vote for, the fall elections. So that's why we're doing this as we start now. And the other reason is because we are really trying to build relationships with voters ahead of time because it is crucial. And I'm sure you guys have many of you have heard that, the saying of oh, Democrats only knock on my door or call my phone when they need my vote. And we are trying to avoid that at all costs because that's not what we are trying to do. We really want to make sure that voters feel heard and really, get the information they need and the resources that they need to exercise their right to vote. And the other thing is that in Wisconsin, some of you might know, folks can request their absentee ballot at the beginning of the calendar year for the rest of the year. And the reason why we'll continue to do, the absentee ballot asking voters to request their absentee ballots because it is a very, very crucial voting method that has shown to work. In 2020, for instance, 98% of the voters that requested an absentee ballot turned out to vote one way or another. So even if they didn't use their absentee ballot, they turned out to vote. And that's very important. And that is because we had those initial conversations with folks and, letting them know that they could do that. And so that's why we're starting very early and even with the local elections. So that being said, it could, this work cannot be done without your help. It was done with incredible help from, folks from across the country in 2020 and on. And so you guys being here today, taking the training, even if you're not going to be calling into Wisconsin, it's crucial that, we are having these conversations. And even in your own state, you being there, making those calls and having these conversations with voters becomes the difference, right, between winning and losing. So thank you for being here. Thank you for doing what you do, taking the training, helping us out here in Wisconsin, running, helping out your state, because as we know, voting rights are on the ballot. It's not explicitly said, but they are on the ballot, and making sure that we are bringing this to voters and they know what's going on will help us, fight for our democracy and make sure that we uphold our democracy and our rights. So thank you to every single person on this call. Thank you to the trainers and all of you guys for being here. And with that being said, I will hand it over to Elizabeth to get going with the training.
Thank you so much, Viola. So before we jump in, just a few caveats. Some of what we share today may be very different than approaches you've used in the past. We have a lot of respect for traditional organizing approaches. But for some conversations, especially with people who rarely or never vote, it can be useful to have some additional tools. We don't expect you to use everything that we try out today. If you come away with 1 or 2 new ideas, that would be a huge success. Also, I know some of you may have a lot of background in motivational interviewing. And while the tools we are sharing today are inspired by motivational interviewing, we've taken liberties to adapt these approaches to voter engagement in a very applied way. And we know we are just scratching the surface. We hope that you will still find a few useful nuggets. So to start off, I'd just like to take a moment to ask you to think about what might be possible if we elected Democratic supermajorities at the local, state, and federal levels. What if Democrats not only had the White House, but let's say 80% of the Senate and US House seats? What if our state legislatures were controlled by Democrats and mayors, school boards, and other local offices were also held by Democrats? What might be possible? Take a moment to dream big, and then we invite you to name some of those accomplishments in the chat if this dream came true. For example, I personally would want universal health care. If you have some ideas, yeah, passage of climate crisis legislation, yes. Anybody else have anything on your wish list? Liz, renewables, yes. Rachel, passage of the Voting Rights Act. Chris, easier access to the vote. Nora, abortion rights legislation. Higher minimum wage. Andy says voter protections. Fergal, fix the Supreme Court. Tom, universal pre-K. Cheryl, ERA. This is fantastic. Helen, addressing inequalities in housing and education in our city. Oh my gosh, sign me up. Yes, this is fantastic. Thank you. I invite you to keep these great possibilities in the back of your mind and keep them going, please. This makes my my heart just open wide thinking about what the world might be like if we were able to make some of these a reality. So just keep these in mind as we go through the training and as you do the hard work of reaching out to voters this coming year. So now we'd like to give you a bit of context. We all know how close the 2020 elections were. Less than 43,000 voters in Arizona, Georgia, and yes, Wisconsin decided the outcome of the Electoral College. And I'll give you just a moment to take a look at this amazing slide. I know there's a lot going on this slide, but it shows the popular vote in the 3 most recent elections when you include all eligible voters. So the number of eligible voters is determined by census data. It includes citizens age 18 or older who aren't barred from voting because of past felony convictions, depending on the laws in their state. So the Democrats in blue and the Republicans in red are pretty close in 2016, 2018, and 2020. That little narrow purple band represents third-party voters, which includes some of those elusive swing voters we hear so much about. But perhaps our greatest opportunity for impacting the election are the voters represented in green, eligible voters who did not vote. In 2020, a year when we saw the highest turnout in over a century, 34% of the electorate still did not cast a ballot. Many in that group were young people, people of color, and lower income voters, people who may be inclined to support progressive priorities. Of course, some of those people have their votes suppressed. Others just need help navigating logistics like confirming their polling place or how to request an absentee ballot. But there is some portion of this 34% that flat out is not interested in voting or only votes occasionally. Midterm elections historically have lower turnout. As you can see in 2018, 52% of eligible voters did not vote. That's something to keep in mind in this year's elections. So people who rarely or never vote are often labeled low propensity voters. But I like a term used by Anat Shenker-Osorio, a Democratic communications consultant. She calls them high potential voters. That focuses on their strength and their power. If we could encourage even a fraction of these high potential voters to get out and vote, it could have a big impact. So engaging with voters isn't a one-size-fits-all process. Instead, I try to tailor my approach based on how the conversation unfolds. So here, the voter is in blue and my responses are in green. If they're a strong or likely Democrat, the traditional approach of mentioning a few of the candidates' talking points and making a plan to vote probably works great. This is essential to any campaign and helps to ensure that our strongest supporters have all the information they need to vote. If I encounter someone who would never vote for a Democrat or happens to be rude, I don't try to change their mind. I politely say, "Have a great day," and hang up. But at least once each shift, I talk to someone who tells me, I'm not voting. Bingo, I have just connected with a member of the 34%. But how should I respond? There are three pathways. The first is just to thank them and hang up. Some phone bank scripts actually say to do this, but I think this is a lost opportunity. The second path is to preach at them. Recite the talking points and tell them all the reasons why this election is so crucial. That usually doesn't work very well. It feels bad to talk at people, and it really feels bad to be on the receiving end of that. The third path requires me to shift gears and slow down. I try to get curious. Can I view the voter like an anthropologist would? Show empathy and be non-judgmental. Listen more than you talk, especially at the beginning. Ask open-ended questions, then silently count to 10 to give them a chance to respond. It's challenging, but this approach can make the conversation more effective and satisfying for the voter and for you. Let me tell you about one of these high potential voters. In December 2020, I was calling Georgia for the Senate runoffs, and I spoke with a voter I'll call Ophelia. She was really stressed out and didn't know there was another election in January. She said, I don't have time to think about politics, and I just try to tune them out. She couldn't even remember the name of the president, but she said she didn't like him. She described how hard things were with her mother, who had lots of health issues. Although Ophelia got laid off during the pandemic and her unemployment had run out, she still helped her mom financially. This went on for about 25 minutes, and I wondered if I was wasting my time, but she really wanted to talk. I said I was so sorry to hear about her situation and that I had also had a sick parent, and I knew how hard that could be. Then Ophelia asked if I was a Democrat, and I said yes. And she said she leaned that way too, but she hadn't voted in November. I said, oh, interesting. Tell me more about that. She said, I figured Trump was going to win again. So what was the point? I said, I'm really glad Biden will be our next president, but it was a really close election and it showed that we needed every voter. I said, it would be tragic if Biden can't get anything done because the Republicans still control the Senate. They've blocked the Democrats for years. And the latest pandemic relief bill, the Democrats wanted to include money for things like extended unemployment benefits, but the Republicans refused. If they keep control of the Senate, That'll probably continue. But if the Democrats win these 2 Senate seats in Georgia next week and gain control of the Senate, we can help people who really need it during the pandemic. Something clicked for Ophelia. She said, okay, that's it. I'm going to vote, and I'm going to make sure my family does too. I said, wow, that's great, Ophelia. Could you spread the word to 3 people you know? She said, yeah, my husband works in construction and he has 100 coworkers. Most of them didn't vote in November either, but we'll tell them that now that we have a new president, we want to make sure he can get things done. So get out and vote on January 5th. We're Hispanic and we're going to get this going. We'll tell them get out the vote and then come to the cookout. I said, wow, Ophelia, you are really connected to the community. You and the people you know could decide the outcome of the runoffs. I asked if I could send her information about early voting and text her a reminder on election day, and she said, sure. So afterwards, I texted her. This is what she wrote back. God works in mysterious ways. You made my day. Yes, I will take all my friends to the polls. I can literally imagine the poll workers' faces when we walk in. Unfortunately, I don't have a loudspeaker. I would go around town announcing it, ha ha. That's just one example of how eliciting of voters' concerns, trying to respond from the heart, and connecting what they care about with what's at stake in this election can help them draw their own conclusions about voting. One approach to do this is to incorporate some tools of motivational interviewing, or MI. This approach has been around for decades in fields like psychotherapy and social work. It's been shown through hundreds of clinical trials to help people change their behavior. But you don't have to be a psychiatrist or a social worker to incorporate some of these approaches. In a minute, I'll turn it over to Dr. Jackie Tulsky. I met her last year through my work as a freelance medical writer. Jackie is an internist who's had decades of experience caring for patients at San Francisco General Hospital who have HIV, substance use disorders, and mental health issues. And yet, even with these huge challenges, some are inspired to make big life changes, like taking a step towards reducing their drug use or getting a COVID vaccine. She uses motivational interviewing to engage with compassion, drawing out their own intrinsic desires to change, and helping them align their actions with those desires. Jackie is also a motivational interviewing trainer, and we're so lucky to have her with us to share some ways for applying these tools to effectively engage with voters, especially high potential voters. Jackie?
Thank you, Elizabeth. I feel so lucky to be with you all today, and I'm really grateful for your interest in learning about motivational interviewing and how to apply it to conversations with potential voters. So what is motivational interviewing, or MI for short? It's a method of communicating which seeks to draw out someone's own motivation to help them sort out their own ambivalence for change. Ambivalence is something that most of us are pretty familiar with, feeling 2 ways about something at the same time. I mean, I personally want to eat healthy, but that bag of chips knows my name and is calling me over. And although many people are not happy with their elected leaders, life doesn't seem to change much no matter who's in office. So why bother voting? There are some specific skills and tools that we can use to have MI consistent conversations, but learning MI really starts with a philosophical approach to communicating. The spirit of MI has really 4 principles and the acronym of PACE. Interestingly, all 4 of these are woven through Elizabeth's conversations with Ophelia, helping Ophelia resolve ambivalence about voting. The first is partnering. We try to take the attitude that what the person we're talking to thinks and has to say is as important as what we have to say. We ask questions that are open, that invite the person to tell us more. We listen to what they are ambivalent about and what they wish would change and why. For example, we learned that Ophelia had too much to do, and so much felt out of her control. But she didn't like Trump, and there were things that were very important to her, like taking care of her mother. With autonomy, we honor a person's control of their own decisions. We recognize and respect the right not to change. Maybe Ophelia will vote her interests, and maybe she won't. When we acknowledge and accept another person's autonomy, they have the space to move forward rather than feeling backed into a corner defending their initial position. Compassion is the third principle. We have empathy for how hard it is to change ourselves or the world. We express genuine curiosity about what motivates a person's actions and what might help them do something different. When Elizabeth listened to Ophelia's troubles and says, "I know what it's like to care for a family member," she shows compassion for how hard it is to be human. That sharing is not meant to shift the focus away from Ophelia, but simply to acknowledge that, yeah, it would be hard to add one more thing like voting to your very busy life, and yet you managed to do so much. And the final principle is evoking, drawing out the person's own ambivalence and helping them explore reasons why they might want to make a change. Ophelia talked about her life, and Elizabeth says, "Oh, tell me more about your family, your work." Evoking means asking the person what they want to change. If you elected a person that listened to you, what 3 things would you want them to know? Or if an honest person was elected, what 2 or 3 things might be different a year from now? We use PACE, the 4 principles in the spirit of MI, to support all the other MI skills. So communicating with MI helps the people we talk to, but I think it also really helps us. We may see people in a different light, and MI supports our ability to engage with them. I know many of you have done hours of phone banking and canvassing, and perhaps you felt a little discouraged between hang-ups and people who are adamant that they don't vote. It's really common to feel frustrated with important but difficult work. If they would just listen and understand why they need to change. I know a version of that feeling. After 15 years at San Francisco General, the public hospital, I love the job caring for people, but really most of my patients had problems that had never seemed to improve. I was frustrated and really on the edge of burnout. A colleague of mine was trying to help me and thought maybe I should look into this communication thing called motivational interviewing. So I took an intro course. It was such a revelation. You know, it turned out that making people change was not my job. My job was to help them find their own reasons or motivation to change. Soon after that course, I saw a patient that I'll call Joe. We'd had at least a 10-year relationship, and some of his medical problems were better, but it was really clear that his heavy drug use, not his HIV infection, was going to be the cause of his death. The more I tried to tell him how dangerous it was, the more he kind of dug in his heels. According to Joe, cocaine was not the problem, and he was very turned off by my approach. So with the MI spirit in mind, I was ready to try something different. Hey, Joe, thanks for coming in today. Say, can we take a couple minutes here to talk about your lab results? That's okay with you? Okay, great, thanks. So you're doing wonderfully with your HIV meds. Your virus here, you can see by these numbers, is totally under control. But Joe, the drug test showed cocaine again. What do you think about that? Doc, I know what you always have to say. Well, I don't know. Tell me more about crack cocaine. I mean, what do you like about it? He looked right at me, immediately started talking. Whoa, you feel like you're riding a rocket ship. I mean, you have energy and ideas. You feel so good, like you can do anything. My back pain disappears. You never want to stop. I'm like, oh, wow. So what if anything's not so good about using? Thinks about it for a second. I hold my tongue. Well, the rocket ship falls to Earth. You crash, you're wrecked. The rocket ship falls to Earth? Yeah, and you're broke. You have nothing for food or bills for the rest of the month. He seemed surprised to hear himself say this, and I was frankly stunned. It never occurred to me that he would have such rich things to say about using or why he might not want to use. Pain relief, wasted money, feeling bad afterwards, all things that we had never talked about. It's about 5 years later now, and that conversation marked a big change in our relationship and how I saw Joe and other patients like him. It started with me listening and Joe hearing what he had to say. I'm no longer the one that brings up reasons to stop using. And in fact, he uses very little now and eventually plans to stop because it turned out that his life and health goals did not include cocaine. And me, I'm still at San Francisco General. MI reminds me that I'm not driving the bus. Excuse me for the choking up. I always do this with Joe. But I just have to help people figure out where they want to go and maybe the best route. Although, you know, people often know the roads pretty well. Thanks for listening to that. MI-guided conversations like the ones you just heard with Ophelia and Joe, they can be learned. It's not a natural gift. There are skills and tools that can be acquired. There's even ways to give information so you're not the sage on the stage taking over the conversation, but a partner who's helping expand the person's engagement in their democracy. So let's look at a few MI tools and skills, starting with an OR. So OAR is a reminder of 3 ways to start and keep a conversation going. Open-ended questions, they can't be answered with a yes or a no, are sincerely curious and non-judgmental. And people may need time to answer, so you have to wait, even count to 10 if no response. If they start responding, you can encourage them to keep talking without interrupting them by, making those sympathetic sounds like mm-hmm and oh, uh-huh, and wow. Here are some examples. Tell me more about not voting in last November. What's not so good about crack cocaine? There's one special type of open-ended question called the ruler, and it can be especially helpful for assessing a voter's motivation level. For example, you could ask them, on a scale of 0 to 10, how likely are you to vote, with 0 meaning very unlikely and 10 meaning very likely? If they say 3, then you could ask, why isn't that number 0 or 1? And they may share some interesting information about why they might be interested in voting. And then you could follow up by asking, well, what might boost your 3 to a 4 or a 5, a higher number? And that can open the door for them to share things that could help them take the next step toward voting. Affirmation, the A, acknowledges efforts or strengths. It can be so hard to take care of a family member, is one example. Or you're really connected to the community. Or you've made real efforts to vote. Reflection, or repeat or interpret what the voter says. It helps the voter hear themselves. And honestly, it's probably the hardest part of OR. When Joe says the rocket crashes, I just simply repeat his words, the rocket crashes. When Ophelia tells Elizabeth, I figured Trump was going to win, so what was the point? Elizabeth chooses to interpret a little and says back to her, the election was really close, and it showed that we needed every voter. So there's OR, a very useful MI tool that can help someone talk about their frustrations, but also their priorities. Elizabeth, can I give it back to you?
Yes, thank you so much, Jackie. So I just wanted to note a few things about OR and how to use these elements strategically. First of all, we're not saying that all closed-ended questions are bad. They are definitely super helpful in some situations, like asking, have you received your ballot yet? And while we encourage you to strategically pause and count to 10 after asking open-ended questions or sharing a reflection, sometimes pausing is less useful, like when the voter first answers the call and you're introducing yourself. With practice, you'll gain a sense of which elements of OR are useful at what points. Also, I just want to emphasize that these techniques are not foolproof. We don't want you to think that if you do them perfectly, that no one will ever hang up on you. Honestly, with some voters, I could be Gandhi or Stacey Abrams asking the most thoughtful, open-ended question or reflection, and they would still hang up. Instead, maybe these approaches will help an extra 5 to 10% of voters stay engaged with you, and that can make all the difference in close elections.
Mm-hmm.
Great. So in a moment, we'll show an example of how to use open-ended questions, affirmations, and reflections in a real conversation. But since I'm on the topic of getting hung up on, first I'd like to say a few words about getting past hello. The first minute of a conversation is critical. It's when they're most likely to hang up or close the door. The most important thing is to try to establish a respectful connection right from the get-go and to keep that conversation going. I like to think of this as one of those fairy tales where the hero or the heroine has to get across the moat before they can enter the castle. Jackie and I will demonstrate the first couple of minutes of a conversation. Listen carefully for how Jackie builds rapport right from the start. Also, note any open-ended questions and reflections that you hear her use. We invite you to put these into the chat. For example, you could put open. If you could change anything about the country, what would it be? Or reflect. You wonder if one vote makes a difference. After this demo, we'll give you instructions for practicing a similar conversation in small groups. So now Jackie will call me on behalf of Wisconsin's Governor, Tony Evers, who's running for re-election this November in a very tight race.
Ring, ring.
Hello?
Hi, my name is Jackie. May I speak to Elizabeth Chur, please?
Yeah, that's me. What's this about?
Oh, I really appreciate you taking my call. I'm a volunteer with the Wisconsin Democratic Party. I'm not calling to ask for money. We're just trying to find out.
I'm sorry. I really hate these calls and I'm busy right now.
You know, I hear you. I don't like making these calls either. And yet, at the same time, this upcoming election for governor feels really important. It would be so valuable if you could just give me a minute to share some of your thoughts about where things are headed in Wisconsin.
I don't vote.
Oh, interesting. Tell me more about that.
It's just a waste of time. All those campaign promises and then nothing changes. I'm so sick and tired of it. I've got enough to do without that. Well, you know, I mean, like I've voted before, but my life sure didn't get any better.
You voted when you thought it would impact you.
Well, yeah, I thought it might make a difference, but then nothing happened. I mean, look at things now. COVID's still here. It took forever to get the kids back in school. And then my husband lost his job and we didn't have health insurance for 6 months. I don't have time to pay attention to who's running for a local dog catcher or whatever.
You're a really strong person who's juggling a lot. If you had a chance to actually talk to the governor, I'm wondering what 2 or 3 things would you want him to put on the top of his to-do list?
I have no idea. I really don't know.
Well, I'm wondering if you could change 2 or 3 things about Wisconsin, what would that be?
2 or 3 things.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I don't know. I have no idea how we're going to put the kids through college. I mean, we're barely making ends meet right now, and the cost just keeps going up. So that's one thing. And it was really scary going through the pandemic without health insurance. So I would do something about that.
All right, time out. Wow, thank you for doing the practice with me, Elizabeth. I'm nervous as a caller, but you told me a lot of interesting things. Let's see what you all heard in the chat. So let's see.
Yeah, so John says, could you share some thoughts about where things are going in Wisconsin? An open-ended question.
And Dara heard a reflection. You voted when you thought it would make a difference.
Mm-hmm.
Let's see, open. Here's another one. If you could change 2 or 3 things about Wisconsin, what would it be? And then person noted a strategic pause. Great. Thank you for that. Yeah, it's hard. It's sometimes hard to tune your ear. All right. But now I think I'm going to turn it back to Elizabeth for the instructions.
Great. So now we'd like to give you a chance to practice the first few minutes of a voter engagement conversation in groups of 2 or 3 people. So the instructions are on page 1 of your handout, which we sent by email a few days ago. And in case you still need that handout, we've dropped the file into the chat one more time. We highly recommend that you print it out or download it and have it available on your screen. So the person whose name comes first in the alphabet starts off as the volunteer. The next person alphabetically in your group is the voter. And the last, if you have a third person, is the observer. So for example, Alicia would start as the volunteer, Maria would be the voter, and Zachary would be the observer. We'll do 3 rounds of practice during this session, so you'll get a chance to try out all 3 roles. So as the volunteer, you're respectful, curious, and trying to build rapport with the voter. Try to get the voter to talk about why they're reluctant to vote, and try to use at least 1 open-ended question and 1 reflection. In this practice, you're just trying to get the ball rolling, and you don't need the voter to commit to anything yet. Try to listen more than you talk. As the voter, you're busy, but you're willing to talk, especially if you sense that the voter cares about what you're saying. Try to channel someone you know, or perhaps someone you've talked to before on the phone or in person who's reluctant to vote, but they're willing to hear what you have to say. You can push back a little bit, but don't be the grumpiest voter in the world. And if you get a chance to be the observer, listen carefully and write down a few notes to yourself about any open-ended questions, reflections, or strategic pauses that you hear. Being an observer is actually a really great learning opportunity. You get to actively listen and tune your ear to the voters' priorities and ambivalent feelings. And you also get to watch the ways the volunteer helps the voter to hear their own reasons to change. Every 5 minutes, we'll ask you to switch roles. Your group will have 15 minutes total to practice. And if you only have 2 people in your group, try to divide your time about evenly between the voter and the volunteer roles. So in each round, you probably won't get a chance to finish an entire conversation, but that's fine. We mostly want you to practice getting across the moat and using open-ended questions and reflections. So today we have some fabulous volunteers helping out. Dara, Cheryl, and Charlie. If you're here, could you just raise your hands and wave a little bit so people can see you? So one of them, or Jackie or I, may pop into your room in case you have questions or need some guidance. If you're having any technical difficulties, or if you're the only person in your room, you can send a chat message to Myra, our Zoom host, or come back out to this main room and she will help you out. So we will see you in about 15 minutes.
Welcome. Great. Wow. I heard some fabulous conversations going on in those breakout rooms. And I suspect the co-TAs did as well. Let's just take a few minutes now to debrief that practice session. In the chat, would like to go role by role. So think of when you were the voter, what did the volunteers say or do that made you want to open up and talk a little bit more? So please go ahead and put something in the chat that helps explain what, when you were the voter, that the volunteer did. And we'll read off some of your, if that's okay. Here.
Nora says a volunteer really heard my concerns and tried to respond.
John was saying it really helped to be able to vent. And Cynthia notes that personalizing the message made it really helpful.
Yeah. Andy talked about advising it's not a fundraising call. Sylvia said that that the volunteer didn't like to make calls either, and echoed the voters' frustration.
And with Jewel was saying that the empathy was really powerful for her, so that's great. Let's have you switch now. Put on the mindset of when you were the volunteer making the calls. What as the volunteer did you notice about the more MI approach? What surprised you when you were playing the role of the volunteer? Let's see. As the volunteer, what surprised you? So I see Jim said, oh, Julie was really interested in me, and that felt helpful. Nancy saying she felt pretty vulnerable.
Yeah, Chris said voters have opinions even if they don't vote. Let's see. Helen talked about it was a relief not to have to convince somebody of something.
The way MI supports you as well as the person you're talking to. And then when the voter asked me what Evers could do for me, I felt stumped. It's true. It doesn't always, being that open-ended doesn't necessarily give you a specific answer to give back to the person. So let's do the last, thank you. So thank you. Those are all really great observations. And then the final, for those of you that had a chance to play the observer role, what did you notice that might shape your own approach as a volunteer? You put that in the chat, just some observations when you played the observer role. Let's see here. I think Bob's comment actually is a little bit appropriate where I'm not driving the bus and I kind of got stumped a little bit. Any other observer? Nora's saying, I admired the way my partners were able to sound relaxed and natural.
Holly talked about the caller asked for the person to reflect on a time that was less pessimistic. That's kind of an interesting way to shift the energy of that conversation. Wendy talked about being able to give the voter more time to answer.
And Lynn is saying something that we've all noticed, that if the pause is too long, it can be opportunity for the voter to hang up, especially early on. So the also that quick connection to the voter is important. All right. Well, thank you. Really, really excellent practice, and appreciate the willingness to put things in the chat so that you all have a sense of what kind of things people are noticing in the other rooms. All right, so let's shift gears a little bit. Once you've gotten across the moat you have the opportunity to enter the castle and get to know more about what's important to the voter. Some of you may have already started to do this in the practice session we just had. As the flow chart shows, when we switch gears into motivational interviewing mode, we bring our non-judgmental curiosity to the conversation. We really try to listen more than we talk. Open-ended questions, affirmations, and reflections are all tools to help do this. It helps someone elicit something we call change talk. The heart of MI is the skill of listening for and amplifying change talk. Now, change talk is really any expression of reasons to change behavior or opinions. It may be a comment about what the person did in the past, or how things were better or different, or something about what concerns them now. The goal is to have the person talk about their own motivations for change and help them hear themselves. Here are some examples of change talk from Joe and Ophelia. The rocket falls to Earth. You're broke, no money for the rest of the month. Or Ophelia's comment of, I don't really like Trump. And remember at the beginning of the training when we invited you to think big and put in the chat what might be possible if we had a Democratic supermajority at all levels of government? You mentioned things like universal health care, election rights and election reform, climate crisis legislation, abortion rights, universal pre-K and daycare, all great examples of change talk. But remember, we said that people often feel ambivalent about change. So what you might hear most when we start a conversation is sustained talk. What is sustained talk? It's like that venting one of you mentioned. It's exactly what it sounds like. Comments that support the status quo, statements that argue for keeping things the way they've been, kind of the just go along to get along approach. And here's some examples from Joe and Ophelia. You feel like you can do anything when you use crack cocaine. Or, I just don't have time to think about politics. I just try to tune them out. Elizabeth, can I ask you to give us some more tips about change and sustained talk?
Sure. So often a conversation with a high potential voter isn't divvied up 50-50 between change talk and sustained talk. Many times they'll say 9 things about why they're not voting, but then they'll mention one little thing that indicates they might have other thoughts or feelings about voting. Milk it. If you listen hard, sometimes people give you this opening. This little shred of change talk is the crack in the wall of the status quo. That's what you want to focus on, reflect back, and invite them to talk more about. You know how mice are so talented at finding food? They don't need you to leave the pantry door wide open. If there's this little crack in the wall, they can squeeze themselves through to get to the good stuff. That's what we want to do if voters give us an opening. Charlie Barron, one of our TAs today, who's also a superstar phone banker, came up with this beautiful observation. We're invited to name the hidden hope, the buried yearning. Sometimes voters don't serve up their change talk on a platter, but they may make negative comments about the elections or the state of the country. But if you bring your curiosity and empathy to these statements, you might be able to gather more intel about what they care about. For example, they might say, politicians make lots of promises, but nothing ever changes. You could say, oh, sounds like you have some ideas about how the country could improve. Tell me more about that. Or they might say, I haven't voted for decades. You could say, oh, you have a trait. What inspired you to vote the last time you did? For this last one, let me tell you about the time in 2020 when I called for Amy McGrath, the Democrat running against Mitch McConnell. I talked with someone who said he wasn't going to vote, but he mentioned that he thought senators should have term limits. I said that Amy McGrath supported term limits and asked if he would consider voting for her since he seems so passionate about this issue. He said, nah. Then I asked, well, is there anything that would motivate you to vote? He thought about it and then he laughed and he said, if Amy called or even left me a voicemail, I swear I would vote for her. We need new people and ideas in government. It's like an old car that keeps breaking down. Sometimes you just have to buy a new one. By asking him that question, he gave me way more information and even committed to vote if he heard from Amy. That was a long way from I'm not voting. So as Jackie mentioned, change talk is the beating heart of motivational interviewing. If someone says things like, I wish that, or I don't like that senators don't have term limits, or if Amy called me, then I'd vote for her, you've really unearthed some valuable information. It can be tempting to jump right in to try to close the deal, but we encourage you to try to dig deeper. Keep using open-ended questions and reflections to elicit more details. Often the voter will share more change talk, helping you better understand what they care about and why. Imagine that you're getting paid $1 for every word that the voter says. By using open-ended questions and reflections to encourage them to keep talking, you can increase your commission. So once you've uncovered that information, then you can offer strategic tidbits of information that directly relate to their own priorities, and then ask them to reflect on what you shared. So if someone says that they work full-time, but they can't pay the bills, you could say, Governor Tony Evers wants to raise the minimum wage. What would your life be like if you earned $15 an hour? Finally, as the conversation winds down, you can use the ruler to assess how motivated they are to vote or to support your candidate. Then you can make an ask that's tailored to their level of enthusiasm. So if someone says they're a 2, it might not make sense to say, can we count on your vote? But we can help them take the next step by offering to text them the candidate's website. Incremental progress is fantastic, especially with the 34%. You're laying the groundwork for the next conversation they have with a volunteer. Of course, if the voter's more motivated, you could help them make a plan to vote, or you can ask them to vote triple by saying, could you make sure 3 friends or family members vote to re-elect Governor Evers? End on a positive note by summarizing any next steps, like I'll text you that information in a minute, and thank them for their time. Now, Jackie and I will do another demo, which will illustrate an entire conversation with a voter. Listen for examples of change talk and sustained talk. Pay attention to ways that the volunteer digs deeper to draw out even more change talk. Again, we invite you to drop examples into the chat. So you could write change, I wish we had honest leaders, or sustain, I've voted before, but nothing changed. This demo is just an example to give you a flavor. We'll give you more time to go deeper in the practice session that you'll be doing right after this. So this time I'm going to be calling Jackie the voter. Ring, ring.
Hello?
Hi, I'm trying to reach Jackie Tulsky.
Who's calling?
Oh, my name is Elizabeth, and I'm a volunteer with the Wisconsin Democrats. I'm not calling to ask for money. I was just curious to find out.
You know what? I'm really not interested in politics. I don't vote.
Oh, tell me more about that.
Telling you more. Listen, I get all these calls. I mean, who knows what people are really calling about? Besides, there's just too many different elections. It's confusing who's running for what and when. I can't keep up even if I wanted to. And frankly, I've got tired of all those crooked politics. I just stopped paying attention.
You want to be able to trust that our leaders are honest. Well, I honestly just want to know some of your thoughts about the upcoming governor's election.
All right, honestly, I don't know much. Sometimes I'm embarrassed by our state government. It's just nothing but fighting. It feels like a 3-ring circus.
Well, it sounds like you know enough to be frustrated. I'm wondering, what would you want the governor to be working on over the next couple of years for you and your family?
I don't know. Like I said, I don't really think about politics.
I get that. I'm curious, what keeps you up at night?
I'm a single mom. I have 2 kids in high school.
Hmm.
They're really smart kids, and I don't know how I'm going to afford college. I work full time at the Pick and Save store. I can barely make ends meet right now.
Hmm.
I want them to be able to get good jobs, but college tuition just keeps going up and up.
Wow, that's for sure. I'm wondering, could I share a bit about what Governor Evers is working on?
Yeah, okay, but just one more minute. I really do have to go.
Okay, I'll make this quick. So before he became governor, Tony Evers was actually a public school teacher and principal, and then he was superintendent of public schools for the whole state. He's really focused on education, and right now he's proposing making college tuition free at all UW campuses for families that earn less than $60,000 a year. I'm wondering what you think of that.
Well, tuition is a big deal.
Mm.
I mean, I didn't go to college because of the cost. I worry my kids don't want to for the same reason. I mean, these days you just can't get ahead without education. I'm kind of glad to hear that about Evers.
So on a scale of 0 to 10, how likely are you to vote in this election, with 0 being not at all and 10 being that you're jumping out of your chair to vote?
Uh, I'd say I'm a 4.
Hmm. What might help you get to a 6?
Well, can you get Tony Evers to come help with my kids' math homework? Then at least I'd have some time to go vote.
Oh, would it be easier to vote by mail? I can send you a link to sign up to do that.
Yeah, actually that would be helpful.
Great. I'll do that right now. And I'm excited. I'm excited that you're considering voting in this election. And I really hope that Tony Evers can earn your vote.
Well, we'll see. It's a possibility. Hey, goodbye for now.
Thanks so much for talking. Have a great day.
All right. Thank you. So let's see what you all noticed. I'm seeing change. Cheryl says change. She's still on the phone. Okay. And now expressing some issues. Mm-hmm.
And Chris says, it sounds like you know enough to be frustrated as a reflection.
And I'm seeing a lot of reflections. Paula is saying she's noticing a lot of reflecting back what the person was saying.
Nora talks about the children's future around change, hope, both hope and fear.
And I'm seeing a lot of nice comments about the comments that our TAs are putting into the chat. So that's actually really helpful. And I want to highlight this one. Chris noticed it sounds like you know enough to be frustrated. So that's a nice way of reflecting back what the person is saying without necessarily repeating exactly what frustrating, sustained things they said. All right, thank you for that. And now it's your turn. I'm going to give it back to Elizabeth to take us through the instructions for the next breakout.
Great. So now we'll give you a chance to practice. Please look at page 2 of your handout, and we will drop it in the chat one more time just in case any of you haven't downloaded it or printed it yet. So this time, the person whose name comes first alphabetically starts off as the voter. Next in the alphabet is the volunteer. And if you have a third person, they'll be the observer. As the volunteer, try to find out what's important to the voter and try to elicit at least one piece of change talk. Dig for details using open-ended questions and reflections. If there's time, make an ask that's tailored to their interest level, but don't worry if you don't get all the way through the conversation. As the voter, you can be a little bit terse or grumpy, but don't be too hard on the volunteer. You're busy, but you're willing to talk, especially if you sense the volunteer cares about what you're saying. Then you can open up and say more about what's important to you. As the observer, focus on listening and noting examples of sustained talk or change talk. And for bonus points, you could also track open-ended questions and reflections. So this time we'll give you 20 minutes total, so about 6 to 7 minutes per round, and we will prompt you to switch roles kind of partway through. And if you only have 2 people in your group, try to spend about half the time as the voter and half as the volunteer. So we'll see you soon.
Welcome back, everybody. Thanks for coming back. Thanks for the great, once again, very impressive conversations going on in the rooms. I heard some thoughtful dialogue, some naughty conundrums, KNOTT, conundrums being brought up. Let's do like we did after the first practice session and take a few minutes to debrief. Put on your role when you were the voter, the person being called. What, and if you could drop into the chat, what did the volunteer say or do that made you want to open up? If you could go ahead and put some things in the chat. So again, thinking of yourself as the voter, what kind of things encourage you to keep talking? Let's see if we have some.
Paul says shows that they were really listening to what I was saying.
Mm-hmm. I see.
Oh, I love this. Go for it, Jackie.
Oh, and John's comment about, I do have a magic wand. It's called the vote. That's great.
Julie said, is there anything that you would want to see different in the state? Nancy talked about empathy, reflecting back. Mark talked about asking why I don't vote.
Mm-hmm. And Tom mentions a caller, let me be as cranky as I needed to be, which is really great, the venting. All right, wonderful. Let's switch now. Think of yourself as the volunteer, the person who was making the calls. Were there examples of sustained talk and change talk that you heard from your voter? If you could drop some of those into the chat. See. As the volunteer, what examples? Yes. So Van is saying that listening to my venting felt good and it wanted me to keep doing it. Mm-hmm.
Chris says, as a voter, reflecting back what I said made me think of how important what I want is to me.
Jenny found the ruler method very useful, which is great as a technique. Venting is a good example of sustained talk. That's exactly right. And so you're noting that it's not just a person being frustrated at you. You're noting that this is sustained talk, and then how can that be moved slightly toward more change? What's the hidden hope behind that?
Harper talks about, we got rid of Trump. How did we do that?
And Leah noticed that what motivated you to vote the last time was a good open-ended question that brought out some change talk. All right. That's a good place to stop then with the observer role. So those of you that got to observe, what did you notice this time that might shape your own approach as a volunteer? Things about bringing out the change talk or sustained talk. If you could drop a couple of those responses into the chat.
Ooh, Rachel says, when I observed the caller responded to the voter's complaint that she wasn't being heard, we're calling to listen. Ooh, that's a good one. I'm going to steal that one for my future calls.
Really. Nora noticed that the volunteer really let the voter talk. It's very, very hard to do.
Yeah, Paul talks about must use very active listening to be an effective caller. Yes. Oh, Chris talked about mentioning that these elections are close to home. Yes, especially the local elections coming up April 5th.
And Lynn noticed asking about the ruler, the 0 to 10. Wow, you all heard some really. This is a great group. You are a great group to be training. That's all I can say. Thank you so much for both doing the practice, observing, giving us some feedback. that participation, it helps you as a learner, it helps us as teachers. Now I'm going to give it back to Elizabeth to close out the training today.
Great. So just in a minute, we will start wrapping up the formal part of the training, including one more story I want to share with you. But first, just a few other items. We would love to get your feedback about today's training. So we're dropping a link for a 2-minute survey into the chat. Would love your input. And we will also send you the slides in a follow-up email. We know that we just threw a lot of information at you today, and it can be a lot to process. When talking with the 34% or really any voter, it's impossible to anticipate every single situation that might come up. But just like basketball players practice skills like they're dribbling, passing, and shooting so they're ready for a game, we hope that you've been able to learn some core skills that can help you navigate obstacles and tune into opportunities when talking to voters. We hope that you will continue practicing these skills in the coming days, not just with voters, but you could also get practice when you talk to your friends and your family and your coworkers. So one great way to practice these skills is to phone bank. So now that you've had some practice making calls to voters, you can call real Wisconsin voters in the next few weeks. Viola and Holly will be dropping sign-up links in the chat. There's actually a phone bank to Save the Senate tomorrow, Sunday at 5 p.m. Central Time. And on the next few weekends, March 19th and 20th, March 19th and 20th and March 26th and 27th, there are 2 big weekend of action phone bank extravaganzas with multiple shifts where you can call Wisconsin voters ahead of the April 5th local elections. There's a lot at stake in those elections, including a special election for the mayor of Milwaukee and helping to elect officials at the county level who will help ensure that future elections are run fairly and that ballots are counted accurately. If you found this training helpful, please spread the word about our next one. We'll be teaching this workshop again on Saturday, April 30th, and we would love to see some of your friends there. We're dropping a link in the chat, and we will also include a link in our follow-up email. We know that many of you are involved with other organizations, and you are welcome to share this content with them and to adapt it to your own needs. For example, another group used some of the content that we shared today to create their own training to use motivational interviewing to encourage volunteers from 2020 to get back in the game. So feel free to email me with any questions about that or anything else. I just put my email in the chat. So we are truly grateful to the WisDems for inviting us here today and sponsoring this event, and just want to thank them. And also many, many thanks to all the folks that helped out behind the scenes, including Myra Levy as our Zoom host, Martha Knutson as our slide diva, Dara Friedman-Wheeler, Cheryl Phippen, and Charlie Barron as our teaching assistants, Myra and Charlie for their assistance with content development, and Viola and Holly, and also Mary Borgers, and many others for promoting the workshop. So before we close, I would like to leave you with one last story. In October 2020, I called Dallas for Joanna Katnack, a Democratic candidate for state legislature. I spoke with a 30-year-old named Juan, and he told me, "Oh, I'm not voting." I said, "Oh, interesting. Tell me more about that." He said he wasn't a political person, that he'd never voted, and he wasn't going to vote this year either. I tried to stay curious and non-judgmental. This not voting thing is something I only read about in the paper, but here was a live person who could give me more insight into what goes into that decision. I asked whether his friends voted, and some of them did, and they were all over the map from conservative to liberal. They all got along, but they didn't talk much about politics. I asked if he were in charge, what he might change about the country. He said everything was fine. He still had his job, and his friends and family hadn't been affected by the pandemic. I said I was really glad to hear they were doing okay. And then, almost as an afterthought, he mentioned he wasn't wild about President Trump. And my ears perked up. "Oh, really? What don't you like about him?" "Oh, I don't like the way he talks about Mexicans." I said, "Yeah, he said some pretty intense things." "You know, it's possible that Texas could flip blue this year. The presidential race is going to be really close, but if Texas went blue, that could decide the whole election." He still wasn't interested in voting. So I asked him, would it be okay to text you information about how to vote by mail? It might give you more options if you decided you did want to vote. And if you didn't want to vote, you could just throw your ballot away. He said, yeah, I could send him information. I also asked if I could call back in a few weeks to check in. He said, sure. So I thanked him for his time. We had talked for over 20 minutes and said goodbye. I knew it was a long shot, but at least he hadn't hung up on me. So on election day, I called him back. He picked up and he totally remembered me. And I said, I'm so curious. Did you end up requesting an absentee ballot? And before I could even finish my sentence, he said, I already did it. I voted. And I almost fell out of my chair. He said, yeah, a couple Saturdays ago, my friend and I, we didn't have anything better to do. So we looked up the early voting place and it was 5 minutes away. And we went there. There was no line. It took less than 10 minutes. And I voted for all Democrats, including that local candidate you told me about. I was blown away. I said, when we talked, Juan, you weren't interested in voting. What changed? He said, honestly, our conversation got me thinking. I said, what about it? He said, well, the fact that it went on for so long, other people had called before, but when I told them I wasn't going to vote, they just hung up. You actually seemed interested in my reasoning without trying to persuade me. You just asked questions and listened. And later, I was frustrated with all those crazy things Trump was saying, and I told my friend, come on, let's do this. I said, wow, that's amazing. What would you tell someone else who had never voted? He said, it's easy. It doesn't take a lot of time. I asked if he thought he'd vote again. He said, I guess so. Well, probably. Yeah, definitely. Now that I know how it works, I could almost see his thought process evolving as he heard himself speak. This is our future. This is how things are going to change for the better. One voter at a time, one conversation at a time. Right now, we have a precious window of opportunity to up our game when engaging with at least 34% of the electorate. Voters like Juan and Ophelia and the many other high potential voters like them. So many elections are decided by a handful of votes. Absentee ballots for the April 5th local elections in Wisconsin will be mailed in less than 2 weeks. And this year's midterms, control of state legislatures, 36 governorships, and the US House and Senate hang in the balance, not to mention what's coming up in 2024. We have an incredible chance to boost our turnout levels compared to previous midterms. Until now, we have left a lot of votes on the table. But just think what we could accomplish if we had full participation in our democracy, including many members of the 34%. I invite you to remember the very beginning of this training when you shared such amazing visions of what might be possible if we had democratic supermajorities at all levels of government. Let's work to get a step closer to making those dreams a reality. Let's reach out to every single eligible voter in this year's elections. Let's engage the power of their hidden hopes to transform our country together. So we're going to close the formal part of the training now, but for those of you who have time to stick around, we'll open it up for a few minutes of Q&A. Thank you all for being so generous with your time and attention today, and thank you for everything you're already doing to protect and nurture our democracy. All right, so we will open it up to Q&A, and if you have time to stick around, we'd love to chat with you. If you have a question, we invite you to drop it in the chat. If you dropped it in the chat earlier in the training, if you wouldn't mind just putting it back in, because there's been a lot of messages throughout this training. You can raise your hand by going to the reactions tab in Zoom and clicking the raise hand, or if you can just raise your physical hand and I will call on people to speak. If you happen to be calling in on the phone, you can press *9 to raise your hand in Zoom and then *6 to unmute yourself when you're called on. Also, just please let us know if you don't want your question to be included in the video recording. So let's see, Holly, I know you've had your hand up for a while.
Oh yeah, what I wanted to share now was I just wanted to plug a phone bank that WisDems and I are doing next Saturday morning, and it should be a really fun phone bank. It may not give you a lot of opportunity to practice what you're doing here, but we are working on another tactic of getting voters to talk to their friends and family, and it's an adoptive voter program. So I'll put the link back in the chat. And I attended this training last summer, and I just found it really useful coming back again. So bravo. It's really impressive. And your stories are so encouraging. So thank you.
Wow, thank you. And thank you. Holly is the person who made this all happen and invited us here. So we are so incredibly grateful to you and Viola for making this possible. Jenny.
When you're talking to somebody who complains about Biden and the Democrats haven't gotten anything done, etc., how do you avoid reinforcing the negativity about Biden and the Democrats that's been all over the press, including the New York Times? I canceled my subscription a few weeks ago and wrote them and said, I'm really sick of, Democratic disarray, mansion, cinema, mansion. How do you avoid reinforcing that kind of negativity?
Right. Well, personally, I feel like it's helpful to acknowledge their frustration without kind of diving into it. I think sometimes when people know that they've been heard, and, I heard somebody say, saying, yes, this is not everything that maybe I had hoped and dreamed would be able to be accomplished in this administration. And we're taking a step forward. Or somebody had said, I heard at a presentation recently, well, maybe we have a dysfunctional majority, but it's better than having a dysfunctional minority. And I think, we're starting here, and we can continue working. So what do we need to do to have a bigger majority? What if we flip this Senate seat in Wisconsin that's going to be on the ballot in November? Then we wouldn't necessarily need Joe Manchin's vote, because we'd have a little wiggle room. And I think it's important to acknowledge where they're at, but don't stay there necessarily. And I know that there is I saw some comments earlier, the kind of concern about like reinforcing that negativity. I think we don't necessarily want to pour gasoline on the negativity, but I also feel like I don't want to be a Pollyanna. There are hard things going on in the world, and our system is not perfect. And I think all of that is true. And sometimes people just want to be heard. That's the experience I had with Ophelia, and that was kind of an extreme example, but it was like 25 minutes. And I really, at the time, I'm like, I need to be making more calls. Like, this is maybe just a waste of time. But, to help someone feel heard, I feel like I have sort of proven my credibility that I'm willing to invest that kind of time. And in turn, I feel like not everybody, but some people then, once they feel heard, then they are willing to hear what I might have to say. But I need to kind of demonstrate that willingness first, because I'm kind of coming to their turf. I'm calling them, I'm asking for their time. So I don't know if that's helpful, but I think it's both and, to acknowledge what is hard, what is imperfect, and what are their visions for what they want, and then what might be the next steps for them individually and us collectively to move forward. How about John?
Thank you, Elizabeth. What I find in the trainings and in some of the calls that I do on phone banks, where I'm trying to do this kind of engagement, there often comes a moment where the voter hooks me with their negativity. And it's like, you're right, the system sucks. And anyway, so I think for me, it would be helpful to understand, how do I cross that bridge myself? I mean, to maybe to prepare better, or to just have like some mental jujitsu that I can do when I'm suddenly agreeing with them, right? They're convincing me that it's all, it's not worth the effort.
They're motivational interviewing you in a way. So you're like a plant in the audience, John, to ask that question, because part of the thing I feel like in my story, what really happened with Joe was the recognition that this negativity, the behaviors that just were never changing were affecting me. And it really wasn't my life. It was his life. And the story I tell when we were getting ready to do this kind of training, one of the important reminders is that, once you're able to identify and label something, you're able to give yourself a little distance from it. So when the voter's coming at you, the comments are all very negative and like venting, the way Jenny was talking about, I now say to myself, okay, sustained talk. What I'm hearing is a lot of sustained talk. And what under that is that the hidden hope, like what had they wished would happen, that I can, raise up, acknowledge how disappointed, and then raise up. And so somehow it's like, syphilis, it's a medical idea that we talk about all the time. Syphilis was a mental illness that you needed to be locked up in therapy and until we knew about penicillin. And then suddenly it was a treatable issue. It wasn't something that stigmatized people in the same way. And I suppose it's a little bit of a rocky analogy, but it's the same idea that, when I hear what they're saying and don't let it absorb in me, but recognize, oh, there's some sustained talk. What's the change talk that underlies that? It just somehow does seem to make it easier. I'm wondering if others have thoughts about that.
I guess the main thought that I had in response to the question of sort of not getting sucked into people's negativity, which I guess was actually the prior question, but I thought it might be handy to come back to this issue of the different ways that you can reflect. So you don't have to reflect back the content of what they said. You can reflect back their emotion, which Elizabeth, I think, said too, in a different way, but that you can reflect back their frustration, and that makes a difference. But I think, fundamentally, I think this approach, I'm a pretty big fan. I'm not going to say I use it all the time, but I think like people, if you all go out there and look for opportunities to practice, you will find a whole lot of them in your daily life, just with people you're talking to, whether they're coworkers or your teenage children. So yeah, I think a lot of these strategies can be really helpful.
Cheryl, is there anything you wanted to say?
I think that the thing that this training has really helped me with, and I was thinking back to after I took this, I think I had a phone back maybe the next week or something, and I have my notes in front of me, and I thought, okay, I'm going to try this, and so I got this voter, and I don't even remember the details, but as I was making myself listen to them, inviting them to talk, I could just feel it working. I could feel it being effective with this voter. I don't know what the result was, but I could feel like at least we were having a connection and a conversation. Mm-hmm. And I think that to John's question, regardless of how negative somebody can be or even how negative we feel, we could always ask about, what would you like it to be? What would your dream be? And that's an effective way to get them to talk, and also to lift up ourselves as we're talking to them.
Yeah. Holly, you had another question.
Actually, I had a comment about this, and I think sometimes when I'm talking to someone and I feel their negativity, their discouragement, and it reflects mine, I just say, I just feel like I need to do something to try to make things change, and that's why I'm volunteering my time today, because I do believe that if we can elect the right people, it can make a difference. So, you know, I don't try to deny their experience, but I also, like, I know that whether there's a good outcome or not, I couldn't live with myself if I didn't try to make the most impactful difference that I feel like I can. So I try to infuse that kind of motivation into the conversation.
Great. Jenny, did you have another question?
Yeah, sorry, I'm chiming in again. I put it in the chat. As long as we don't agree with negative voters wholeheartedly, because Biden and the Democrats have done or attempted a lot of really good things, and nobody talks about them. So there's not, you can't get into arguing with the voter, but to not sort of absorb all their negativity without thinking about all the really great proposals in all sorts of areas that have been put out there, and some of them actually passed. So
yeah, I just have to say, I put a note in the chat earlier. I have found, I try to meditate maybe 5 or 6 days a week, and maybe that sounds totally unrelated, but I do feel like that really helps me kind of tap into that centered place, because it's kind of like that calm in the middle of the storm, and to be able to just observe someone else, in their having a hard time or feeling negative, and to be able to empathize, but without having to take that on. And I kind of feel like I need to do most of my venting elsewhere, not in the call. You know what I'm saying? I can empathize, but this is not my place to kind of vent about all the things I'm frustrated about. I can do that offline, because the attention, I think, really needs to be kind of on the voter and drawing out. It's less important what I think, and I think it's more important what they think and how they feel, and most important, what might motivate them to kind of make a change. That's been my experience. Julie, you have a question.
I'm just piggybacking on what Jenny's talking about, and feeling like the fact that the New York Times and every other media outlet you can think of is just picking up on the negative and magnifying it so much with the administration, it just makes our job, I have hardly done anything, but this work all the more important. How much more wonderful that is to be one-to-one with a voter and say, and did you know? Did you know that? Were you interested in? And what the Biden administration has done and is trying so hard to do, and with your help, blah, blah, blah. That's all.
I think I would add in other MI type trainings, they often will say, when you're doing exactly what you're mentioning, Julie, that you first pose it as permission. Can I tell you a little bit about, some of the things that maybe don't get talked about, or would you be interested in hearing more about our example with Governor Evers? So it's asking permission, and then offering up information that might, help give them a contrast to the things that they've been hearing.
Thank you.
Great. Helen, it's great to see you. Thanks for being here.
Yeah.
Hi, Elizabeth. I feel better in that circumstance where a really jaded citizen is like talking about how awful it all is and why bother. It helps me to say, I'm not going to argue with you about that. Because then it's like, just to name it, it's not my job. I didn't call you to talk you out of that. And then you can change the subject to anything you want.
No, you align with them. That's important. You empathize, you align with their feelings, not with their content.
Right.
That's a really nice point.
Jenny.
Here I am again, sorry. I asked a couple of times in the chat how you deal with teenagers 20-somethings who are too cool for school and voting is not cool. And usually I don't even get a chance to say anything. They just hang up on me. But do you have any tips, talking to a parent who's working full time, has a bunch of kids, or, older person with health issues, et cetera, those were the examples given. But if you can manage to get a teenager or a cool 20-something to stay on the phone, how do you keep them on the phone for that particular population?
That's a great question. I gotta say, I've talked to a lot of younger folks. I spent a lot of time in the Central Valley talking to, I'd say, young Latinos in their early to mid 20s. I remember on election day, I spent like 20 minutes talking to this guy who just wasn't going to vote. One line I heard was, you probably wouldn't let your parents pick your playlist. So are you going to let them pick your politicians for you?
Oh, that's a good one.
Yeah. And I talked to one young guy, I think he was 21, again, in the Georgia Senate runoffs in Georgia. He had never voted. And I asked him, he was very polite, but he's like, yeah, I'm not interested. And I said, well, if you could change anything about the country, what would it be? And he said, well, I would probably let non-citizens vote. And I was like, oh, that's interesting. I said, some school districts actually let parents vote in school board elections regardless of citizenship status, but for right now you still need to be a citizen, and you are already a citizen because you're registered to vote. And it could be important for you to speak up and have your voice be heard on behalf of your community, because for the folks in your community who can't vote yet. And that kind of seemed to resonate. And he actually did we talked for quite a while, and at the end, I was like, well, do you think you might consider voting? He's like, yes, I would. I'm like, whoa. And I actually called that guy back too. And he voted early also for the very first time in his whole life. So, I think it is possible. I'm wondering, I know there's people with like some really deep experience in the House right now. I don't know if anybody else has tips for that demographic, because that is a challenging one. But man, if we can get young folks to vote, I think that is our future.
Saw Dara, I think she had to leave, but she had put in the chat, I think it was her, or maybe it was someone else, saying that, one thing about young people and teenagers is they often don't have adults listening to them. So just the power of, what would be important to you, or what would you change, or what's important to you now. And then really listening deeply can be very powerful from a point of view of letting them talk and being respectful. And then I noticed somebody mentioned, one of the issues that we know seems to be important to a lot of young people is climate. And so, do you have any thoughts about specific things like the climate change? And just to see if, again, sort of offering topics in an open-ended way and seeing where that takes you can maybe be helpful.
Great. Well, you have been just an amazing group today. It's been such a pleasure. And we hope to see you at a phone bank at some point. And please tell your friends again about this training. If it was helpful to you, we'd love to be able to have it reach as many people as possible. And we're just so grateful for all the work that you're doing. Thank you.